Welcome to the season opener for the 2020 South African Cross Country Series, the Mpumalanga 400, hosted by Mpumalanga Toyota. As has been the case in Dahlstrom in the past, this was a wet and muddy but very exciting race. All the adrenaline and slip-sliding action of the race is brought to you by Toyota, Ford, Total Quartz and Pirelli. The picturesque town of Dahlstrom in Mpumalanga is known for its quaint shops, trout fishing and changeable weather. And on the weekend of the 28th and 29th of February, the town was once again set abuzz by the arrival of the South African Cross Country Series for the start of the 2020 season. This was the third running of the Mpumalanga 400 with support from Mpumalanga Toyota, and the event again promised plenty of thrills. The weather in Dahlstrom, however, remains a lottery, and this year the SACCS was blessed with plenty of rain, mist and cold temperatures. The DSP was packed with new cars, new crew pairings and new hopes for the upcoming season. We caught up with some of the key players. The man with the biggest target on his back, especially considering that no fewer than 14 Class FIA monsters would line up for the start in Dahlstrom, was defending champion Henk Ladegan.
I think the nerves are coming more from being out of the seat for a little while since last season, so I'm really keen and excited to get back into the car and get the race going.
His biggest competition was sure to come from Toyota Gazoo Racing teammate and former champion Janelle de Villiers, now with Dakar navigator Alex Harrow beside him in the car.
Well, the plan is for him to do the whole season, and we get acquainted to each other a little bit more, so it'll be interesting for him to see the South African countryside for sure.
2019 Class T champion Lance Woolridge made the move to Class FIA for 2020 and also had a new navigator.
We haven't done any racing together, so I think we'll need to bed in a bit with each other. But Vin's very professional, and she's got some championships behind her, so they speak for themselves. So yeah, I'm excited.
With the Class T champion having jumped to Class FIA for 2020, the door is open for a new crew to take the top spot. One man with designs on exactly that was former champion Johan Horn.
But yeah, well, the car is good. We've tested this morning, so hopefully everything goes well.
But the man from Mpumalanga was unlikely to have it all his own way, as Gary Berthold also had his eyes on the same prize and now found himself driving a Total Exilium-sponsored Toyota Hilux.
Really exciting here with Total Exilium backing us, giving this team the gas that it needs. I think the Total Exilium Fuels made the right decision in supporting the two good cars, one in Class T, one in FIA.
There was a similar situation in the special vehicle category, as defending champion Lance Trethui missed the Mpumalanga 400 due to business duties. So with the big man out of the equation, one crew who hoped to make the most of the opportunity was that of Sandra and Jaco Jonk.
We're really excited, and we're so fortunate to have an amazing brand behind us again, Total Agri, sponsoring us again for a second year.
So those were just some of the stories leading up to the start of the 2020 season. In the meantime, the weather had closed in over the highest town in southern Africa, just as the crews prepared for the start of the race. There were, however, some final formalities to take care of before the ceremonial flag drop, namely the distribution of shoes to local school children from the area, sponsored by SACCS and some of its partners. With that done, and a final few words from the local government, the wait for the start of the 2020 season was finally over. It was go time in Dahlstrom. The qualifying race was contested over a section of the route and comprised 64 kilometers of varied terrain. The crews in Class G were at the mercy of the weather, as their side-by-sides offered no protection against the elements, and they bore the brunt of the inclement conditions. In the end, defending champions Werner and Leon Mostert in their Elf Renault-supported Can-Am Maverick set the third fastest time on the day. Just 4 seconds separated them from Dean Bradbury and Timmy Burtis in second place, who in turn lagged just 37 seconds behind the Class G winners of the qualifying race, that of Nico Durant and Deirdre Hutting. Much the same can be said for the souls who took to the route in the specials. The ever-cheerful Sandra Jonk and husband Jaco posted the third fastest time over the qualifying race in their Total Agri Porter, after suffering a 5-minute penalty for missing their start slot due to problems with a fuel pump. This left them way down on the crew in second place, namely Clint Gibson and Alaric Smith in their striker. Gibson and Smith, in turn, were the best part of a minute down on the pace set by John Thompson and Maurice Matten in their Zarco Challenger, who went on to post the fastest time for the specials.
Forest is tight. It's very tight. Good for the 4x4s. For us, it's a bit hairy, but otherwise it's good. Everybody's happy. I'm happy with the team.
In the tin tops, the Class T honours went to Johan and Werner Horn in their Class T Toyota Hilux. Fitting, since they are also the sponsor of this round of the championship. The pair posted a time of 55 minutes and 19 seconds to seal the deal and the top spot. As for the other Toyota crews, Gary Berthold and stand-in navigator Siegfried Rousseau were the best of the rest, going third fastest, just 1 minute and 35 seconds behind the winners. And so on to the big boys in Class FIA of the series. With 14 cars on the Mpumalanga 400 grid, this class has grown considerably, and the competition was fierce. In the end, however, the qualifying race for round 1 was an all-Toyota affair, with Chris Visser and Donnie Stassen going third fastest in their Total Exilium Hilux. The pair finished just 1 minute 16 seconds behind the winners, setting them up perfectly for the main event. Second place in quali went to Janelle de Villiers and Alex Harrow in their Toyota Gazoo Racing SA Hilux, with just 29 seconds separating them from the top spot, which went to teammates and defending champions Henk Ladergan and Brett Cummings in an identical car. Their time of 53 minutes and 11 seconds meant they'd be opening up the route for the main event. A prospect that didn't seem to bother young Ladergan.
Yeah, turns out the time was quite good. It didn't feel like that in the stage, to be honest. It was quite tricky to find the road in some places, long grass.
Here's a quick look at those results again. Class FIA saw Ladergan and Cummings pip teammates de Villiers and Harrow to the post, with Visser and Stassen bagging third place. The winning Class T went to the Horn brothers, with the Cox in second and Berthold and Rousseau rounding out the qualifying podium. The first special home was the Zarco of Thompson and Zamatten, with Gibson and Smith in second, and the wife and husband pairing of Sandra and Jaco Jonk in third. Durant and Hatting were the fastest of the Gs, with Bradbury and Burtis going second fastest, and the Mostards pegging third place in a rather wet qualifying race. And with that, day 1 of the 2020 SACCS drew to a close, setting us up beautifully for the main event of the Mpumalanga 400 in Dahlstrom. Join us again after this break. Welcome back to the picturesque little town of Dahlstrom on the high veld of Mpumalanga for the first race of the 2020 South African Cross Country Series. At exactly 8 a.m. on the Saturday, the flag was waved to signal the official start of the Mpumalanga 400 at the Village Green Cricket Oval. As winners of the qualifying race before, Toyota Gazoo Racing's Henk Ladergan and Brett Cummings had the honour of pulling away first. But this was only the ceremonial start. The real action got underway just a few kilometres up the road when the stopwatch indicated that we were now racing for real. The first few kilometres of the route was on a small stadium section designed to give spectators a good vantage point and to allow them to get close to the action. And this it did, although it was difficult to see with all the mist still hanging around. After the first few cars slipped and slid their way around the slippery section before disappearing into the forests, the stopwatch started to reveal a story. It's usually a disadvantage to open up the road, but on this day and in these conditions, SA cross-country champions Henk Ladergan and Brett Cummings could care less. The Toyota Gazoo Racing SA driver put the hammer down and started to open up a gap over his famed teammate de Villiers and the Spaniard Alex Harrow, reading the notes for the second Gazoo Hilux. Around halfway into the loop, Ladergan managed to extend his lead to just under 2 minutes. There was more movement behind the two Toyotas. Former champion Chris Visser and Donnie Stassen started the race from third behind the wheel of their Total Exilium Hilux, but the farmer from the northwest opted for the wrong tyre setup during the first loop of the race and struggled with little to no grip. Lance Woolridge and Alvin Vonk didn't need more than the one invitation. The Castrol Racing Ranger quickly pounced on the sliding Toyota and moved up into third place, around a minute ahead of Visser at the early stage of the fight. Behind the leading Class FIA cars, the popular Horn brothers from Mpumalanga, Johan and Werner, quickly made Class T their own by converting their pole position into a fairly comfortable race lead in Class T. The standings midway through Loop 1 revealed that the Mpumalanga Toyota was also ahead of the first of the Class FIA Nissan Navaras, driven by gentleman racer Ernst Roberts, with Henry Kerner reading the notes. Roberts is getting quicker and quicker with every outing, and he had to because he had a hard-charging Castrol Ford Racing Ranger behind him, driven by Brazilians Marcus Baumgart and Kleber Cincia. Making up nearly 10 positions in the first 100 kilometers of the race was the Century Racing CR6, expertly driven by Brian Baragwanath and Jean Moore. This car won a stage of this year's Dakar in Saudi Arabia, but conditions in the tight, twisty and very slippery roads here in Dahlstrom were very different, making Baragwanath's performance even more remarkable. Then came the third of the factory Toyota Gazoo Racing SA Hiluxes. By his own account, Shamir Variawa and experienced co-driver Dennis Murphy admitted that he was taking it a little too cautious early on. A puncher halfway through didn't help their cause either. That was a quick glimpse of most of the action from the majority of the production car field halfway through the first of the day's racing loops. But what about the guys and girls in the Mad Maxes of cross-country racing, the so-called special vehicle category? Let's start with the warriors in the side-by-side classes, or Class G, as they are now known, where unlucky defending champions Werner and Leon Mostert had to throw in the towel after hitting a rock and breaking suspension components early on. Someone who did manage to reach the DSP in Dahlstrom was high school teenager Kent Rutherford. Kent is the son of SACCS chairman Archie, who has finally passed the baton on to his son and moved to the navigator seat after decades of competing as a driver. The Rutherfords didn't quite have a clean run and had some space between them and the next car up the road, the similar Can-Am Maverick of Christo Rose and Arno Olivier, who completed the loop in fourth. There was also a bit of daylight between Rose and the men who were currently occupying third, that of Theo Erasmus and Edward Odendahl. Erasmus was sitting safe in third, but had a mountain to climb if he wanted to finish any higher, because the gap to second place, Dean Bradbury and Timmy Burtis, was now more than 11 minutes. Bradbury, on the other hand, had the Class G lead firmly in his sights, because after the 67-kilometer qualifying race and the 157 race loop, the difference between him and Class G leaders was just a little over 2 minutes. The leaders were Nico Durant and Deirdre Hutting, who were doing a good job of finding the balance between going fast and not making those vital mistakes, despite the very tough and slippery conditions. We caught up with Nico in the DSP after Loop 1.
I think the tight sections fitted quite well, but it's tough conditions though.
If the conditions were tricky and treacherous for the guys in the side-by-sides, imagine what it must have been like to fight big 5 and 6 litre V8 powered machines through the wet, tight and twisty tracks, with all that power only going to the rear wheels. Class pole setters and veterans John Thompson led the first part of the race, but the big Zarco Challenger hit one of the many rocks en route and damaged the suspension, forcing them to the sidelines after steering issues. The Mpumalanga 400 marked the second season for Sandra Jonk as a driver after spending many years reading the notes for her father Kutsia Labiskakni. Now, with husband Yako telling her where to go, the pairing wrestled the big Total Agri Porter around the track to reach the DSP in third position in Class A. Ahead of Sandra, newcomer Tim Howes enjoyed a very successful debut race in the Zarco Magnum that he shared with Gary Campbell. But the man who led the special field by a country mile was Clint Gibson and Alaric Smith reading the notes from the passenger seat of the big striker. Gibson had a commanding lead but knew it was far from over.
Going out again now, it's going to be a bit tricky. It's closing in. It's getting difficult to see in the forests. But George, we've got to bring it home in one piece.
Confirmation of the special vehicle category results after Friday's qualifying and the first of the racing loops on Saturday. Clint Gibson had a commanding lead, whilst Nico Durant was the second special vehicle on the board and the first of the side-by-sides in Class G. That was most of the action from Loop 1 of the Mpumalanga 400 here in Dahlstrom. A number of questions were still waiting answers. How would the production cars reach the end of Loop 1? And who would continue to win the race? Join us after the break. Welcome back to a very wet and cold Dahlstrom, host to the first battle of 7 that will make up the 2020 South African Cross-Country Racing Series. We're nearing the end of the first of 2 racing loops that make up the race, and although the weather was cold, the action on the route was steaming hot. We know what the standings were after around 200 kilometres of racing, with Toyota Gazoo Racing SA's Henk Latergan and Brett Cummings extending their advantage at the front of the field. But how would they all reach the halfway marker at the DSP? The battle for top Class T honours was between the Total Exilium Hilux of Gary Berthold and Siegfried Rousseau and the Mullerlaan Toyota Hilux of the Horn brothers, Johan and Werner. In fact, the big fight never really materialised as the Horns simply managed to keep their noses clean and hang on to the lead over their rivals after the qualifying race. Berthold was pushing hard as always and did manage to close the gap a little, but the Horns went into the rest break with an advantage of 35 seconds.
I hope to have a clean run next round and not make mistakes and no punches.
Hey, it's going to be on for young and old, and here we go. We're going to give it a full go.
The faster of the Class T cars were right in the mix with the International Spect Class FIA cars, but let's count them down in reverse order. The Renault of Johan and Sean van Staden was forced to stop after obtaining some suspension damage, whilst former special vehicle champions Marius and Jolinda Fourie were the last of the FIA cars to reach the DSP, but just more than 1 minute slower than another husband and wife team, that of Ramon and Maret Besadenhout, who were 10th in their CR5. A few minutes ahead of them were the 2 King Price Extreme vehicles. Namibian former rally driver Thilo Himmel was making his cross-country debut, with the experienced Gerard Skitter reading the notes, and they were pipped to the halfway mark line by teammates Clint Weston and Gerard Snyman. As always, Weston had lots to say.
That was seriously testing. That was rocks, that was trees, stumps, dams, fences, bigger rocks.
We were nearing the sharp end of the field, and this is where you would find the Toyota Gazoo Racing Hilux of Shamir Variawa and Dennis Murphy. Variawa was still too cautious though, and could only manage 7th at this stage of the race. There was less than a minute separating Variawa from the next car up the road, the Century Racing CR6, expertly driven by Brian Baragwanath and John Moore, who probably couldn't wait to show what their car could do in the dry and open conditions. So into the top 5 we went, and the men in 5th most definitely didn't want to be there. Chris Visser and Donnie Stassen started the race from 3rd, but the Total Exilium Toyota Hilux had the wrong tyres on for the wet, forcing the former champion to drop down the order. This opened the door for a very fast and consistent Ernst Roberts and Henry Kerner to move on up into 4th overall in their Redline Motorsport Miss Navara. And this left us with the 3. The Toyota Gazoo Racing SA Hilux Buckies of Henk Latergan and Janelle de Villiers, and the Castrol Ford Racing Ranger of Lance Woolridge. Woolridge started 3rd, but near the end of the loop, the Ford driver managed to reel in and overtake the Hilux of Dakar legend de Villiers. The difference between the two after nearly 300 kilometers of racing, just 5 seconds in favour of the Ford. All of this, however, only meant one thing, and that was that Latergan and Cummings were controlling the race beautifully out front. The champion started in pole position and by the end of the loop managed to increase an advantage to a full 6 minutes. So this is what the production car scoreboards revealed at the halfway mark. The Horns had a bit of a gap over Berthold, with the Fords of Prinsloo and Koch in hot pursuit. And it's Latergan's name who appears at the very top of the FIA leaderboard, 6 full minutes ahead of Woolridge, who in turn only had a slender 5-second advantage over de Villiers. Back in the service park, the top contenders had a little time to reflect on the race, while the technicians worked hard to get the cars ready for Loop 2. Here's Visser and his story.
We made a wrong choice this morning, and the whole lap was overcautious, and we got a flat tire, so yeah.
There were good reasons for the time lost inside the de Villiers Hilux.
Yeah, unfortunately we had the front brake disc exploded and we had no brakes for the last 20 Ks.
Woolridge, on the other hand, was happy with his progress.
We had a really good lap. Alvin didn't make a single mistake. Yeah, it's just been perfect.
And despite the tough conditions, Latergan managed to open up a comfortable lead.
Oh, glad we made it through clean and didn't get out the car, so we'll have to try and do the same thing for the second loop.
Just one loop of exactly 157 kilometers remained to determine who all the winners were going to be in the first battle of the 2020 South African Cross Country Series. It was midday here in Dahlstrom, but neither the mist nor the rain had lifted an inch, and conditions for Loop 2 would be treacherous. This is the story of the ones who did survive the battle of the Mpumalanga 400. Teenager Kent Rutherford and father Archie, reading the notes inside the Redline Motorsport Can-Am Maverick, came to Dahlstrom with only one objective, and that was to reach the finish. It was his first race as a driver.
I knew what the car could do, I knew what it could go over, I knew where to go fast, where to go slow, and I had my dad next to me, so he calmed me down and got me through the race.
His career started with a 4th place finish, which meant that 3rd and the final podium position in Class G for the day went to Nico Durant and Deirdre Cutting. This duo were leading after loop number 1, but problems saw them dropping down the order. This opened the door for Theo Erasmus and Edward Odendahl to climb up into 2nd, a position they held until the very end. Erasmus came close, but not close enough. The difference between him and class winners Dean Bradbury and Timmy Burtis came down to 1 minute and 4 seconds, but that's all Bradbury needed to clinch his first ever national Class G victory. The conditions were certainly tough, as only 3 of the big V8 monsters in Class A for the special race cars managed to reach the finish line. Sandra and Jaco Jonk found the going tough, but brought the big Total Agri Porter home to claim the points that came with 3rd position, whilst debutant Tim Howes had a lot to smile about. A fine 2nd place in these conditions was a fine result for Howes and Navvy Gary Campbell. But there's nothing like winning, and win is exactly what Clint Gibson and Alaric Smith managed to do from behind the wheel of their striker. The pairing didn't put a foot wrong and were rewarded with a handful of points for the Special Vehicle Championship. There it is, a picture that Clint Gibson won't forget, as his name appears at the very top of the Special Vehicle scoreboard, ahead of Tim Howes and Sandra Jonk. Of the Class G names in the mix, it was the name of Dean Bradbury that came out on top, ahead of Theo Erasmus and Nico Durant. And this is what it's all about, the sweet taste of victory bubbly after 2 days of grueling racing in treacherous conditions. Needless to say, Class G winner Dean Bradbury was more than happy to survive.
I've never ridden a race like this in my life. So yeah, we pushed from the beginning to the end, went well.
Gibson, on the other hand, has plans to hold on to the number 1 spot for the rest of the season.
I just got to say big thanks to Al. He called it well all day and couldn't be happier. Good points.
With the special vehicle race done and dusted, let's shift our attention to the race between Ford and Toyota in the hotly contested Class T of the production car category. Sadly for Malcolm Koch, he was removed from the action during Loop 2, which meant that the podium would be occupied by Boris Prinsloo, Gary Berthold and Johan Horn, but in what order? In the end, Prinsloo put up a brave fight for 3rd in class, a career best and probably the first of many podium finishes to come. This left Gary Berthold and Johan Horn to fight it out for the win. The Horns' Malalan Hilux started the lap with a mere 35-second advantage over the total Exilium version of Berthold. It was a real roller coaster of a ride for both crews, but when the flag was waved, it was the Horns who came out victorious by a narrow margin of 48 seconds. The Class T winning performance of the Horns placed them as high as 6th overall in the entire race. But it also meant that someone still had to win overall, and that someone would be behind the wheel of an FIA specification car. There were a number of retirements late in the race, including Clint Weston, who was going well as the flying redline Nis Navarra of Ernst Roberts, who had to call it a day after an input shaft had had enough. This elevated the very talented Brian Baragwanath up to 5th overall in the Century Racing CR6. In fact, that's wrong, because when the times were added up, Baragwanath and the total Hilux of Chris Visser both took exactly 5 hours, 22 minutes and 17 seconds to complete the race. Unbelievable. A tie for 4th position. Only things left to do was to determine the final order of the podium placings. Remember that De Villiers and the Toyota Gazoo Racing SA Hilux started the loop with a 5-second deficit to the Castrol Racing Ranger of Lance Woolrich, so they had it all to race for. In the end, De Villiers proved just too strong for Woolrich, who's essentially still driving a Class T car, 3rd for the Ford and 2nd for the Dakar Hero. And this only meant one thing, and that was that Henk Lottechen and Brett Cummings drove the perfect race to control the event from the first kilometre of qualifying until crossing the finish line later that day. Well, almost perfect. Unfortunately, our onboard camera had already gone flat when Lottechen approached the end of the race. With just 20 kilometers to go, one of the many trees in the area decided to jump out in front of the Hilux, resulting in a proper collision. Was it not for the fact that the latest Hilux has a mid-mounted engine, it would have been game over. But the champion, nevertheless, made it back to claim his first victory of 2020. And here it is, the Class T scoreboard with the names of the Horn brothers at the tippy top, with Gary Berthold and Siegfried Rousseau in second. Prinsloo and Vermeulen claimed third ahead of Marsh in fourth and Van Tonder in fifth. And not even a single second could separate Baragwanath and Visser in fourth. The podium finishes, however, went to Woolridge in third, De Villiers in second, and Lateghan, who claimed the top step. And speaking of podiums, here are the ones who made it to the winner's podium for the first race of 2020. The Horns from Malalan were hoping that this could be the start of a great season.
All in all, a good day for us, good weekend. We're happy with the result. Vanna was good with the navigation, the car was perfect. So yeah, we're happy.
And let's hear from Lateghan about the tree that very nearly spoiled their afternoon.
I think a bit of luck was on our side there, so managed to limp it home and still keep the lead.
Thanks for joining. That was all the action from the Mpumalanga 400 here in Dahlstrom, and it was proudly brought to you by the South African Cross Country Series in association with Toyota, Ford, Total Quartz and Pirelli.